It was pouring rain. The night air was heavy with exhaustion as Daniel pulled into the driveway of the house he had called home for the past 4 years. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, his pulse steady despite the weariness that clung to his body like a second skin. 12 hours in the emergency room had drained him, left him running on fumes, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him beyond the front door. The house stood in darkness, save for the faint glow of the porch light. But something was wrong. The feeling crept up his spine the moment he stepped out of the car. The weight of unease pressed against his chest, thick and suffocating. Then he saw it, the blinking red light of the security camera he had installed himself. It was on, watching him like an unblinking eye, but something about it felt different, almost hostile. He took a step forward, his breath slow and measured. And then, just as he reached for the doorknob, a voice crackled through the doorbell speaker.
"Daniel, it's you?"
Came the voice, smooth and venomous.
"You don't live here anymore."
It was like a cold hand squeezed his heart. He knew that voice too well. Isabel. His mother-in-law. The woman who had never truly accepted him, who had spent years lurking in the shadows of his marriage, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now it seemed she had.
"What do you think you're doing, Isabel?"
His voice was calm, but inside, the storm was building.
"I changed the locks. Natalie doesn't want you here anymore. Go find somewhere else to sleep."
Daniel inhaled sharply but kept his face unreadable, knowing full well this was what she wanted. A reaction, an explosion. Proof that he was unstable, unworthy of her daughter. But he wouldn't give it to her. He glanced down, spotting the 3 cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly beside the door. His belongings, thrown outside like discarded trash. A cruel little touch. His work shoes, still caked with the remnants of a long shift, lay half-tucked inside one of the boxes. A picture frame teetered on the edge, and when he bent down to pick it up, he saw the deliberate crack running straight through his face. Isabel had always been one for theatrics.
"You're making a mistake,"
he said, his voice dangerously low.
"Oh, I don't think so. Natalie finally sees you for what you are. She's better off without you."
Something flickered in his chest, a slow, simmering burn.
"Where is she?"
"She's with us.
Isabel said, feigned sympathy dripping from her voice.
Recovering. Processing. Realizing the truth."
He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back, forcing himself to stay level-headed. Because Isabel had just played her hand. And she had no idea she'd walked straight into his trap. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen deliberately.
"I'll call her."
A small pause. A misstep in her perfect plan.
"Oh, Daniel. She changed her number. A fresh start and all that."
Daniel smirked. Bold move. Desperate move.
"You sure about that?"
The silence that followed was all the confirmation he needed.
"Isabel,"
he said, his voice like steel.
"I'm giving you one chance to open this door and tell me what's really going on. Because right now, you're committing several crimes, and I don't think you want me to start listing them."
Another pause. This one longer. And for the first time, there was hesitation in her voice.
"This is Natalie's house too,"
she said, but the conviction wavered. Daniel let out a slow, deliberate chuckle.
"That's cute, but here's the problem. You should have done your homework, Isabel. This house, it was never in Natalie's name."
Silence. He could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the walls of her plan starting to crack.
"You should have checked the deed before pulling this stunt,"
he said, already scrolling through his contacts.
"Would you like me to have my lawyer explain it to you? Or should I call the police first?"
Another moment of silence. Then, a sharp inhale. Isabel wasn't used to losing. Daniel turned, walking back to his car without another word. The game had only just begun. Daniel sat in his car, the engine humming softly beneath his fingertips. The night stretched around him, quiet and unassuming, but inside, a storm was brewing. His home, his life, had been ripped from him in a single calculated move. Isabel had played her hand well. Too well. But she had underestimated him. He stared at the house, at the dim light glowing from behind the curtains, and exhaled slowly. He could still hear Isabel's voice over the intercom, dripping with triumph as she cast him aside like he was nothing. She had expected him to break, to rage, to fall apart on her front steps. She expected wrong. His fingers hovered over his phone before pressing a name he hadn't dialed in months. The line barely rang before a familiar voice, tight with unease, answered.
Daniel.
Ryan,
Daniel said, his voice steady.
we need to talk.
A pause. Then Ryan exhaled sharply.
Yeah, we do.
Daniel's grip on the phone tightened.
Have you spoken to Natalie?
Ryan let out a bitter laugh.
That's why I was about to call you. I've been trying to reach her all day. No answer. Nothing. And guess what Mom told me?
Daniel clenched his jaw.
That she needs time alone?
Close.
Ryan's voice darkened.
She said you left. That it was your choice.
Daniel's stomach twisted. Isabel was laying the groundwork, twisting the narrative in her favor, just like she always did.
She's lying.
Daniel said firmly.
Natalie wouldn't do this.
Ryan hesitated.
You think Mom did something?
Daniel's throat tightened.
I think Natalie is in danger.
Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. When Ryan finally spoke again, his voice was quiet.
Meet me in 10 minutes. Same place we used to go when we were kids.
Daniel nodded, even though Ryan couldn't see him.
I'll be there.
15 minutes later, Daniel sat parked outside an old, nearly abandoned diner on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered, buzzing in the still night air. He remembered coming here with Natalie and Ryan years ago, back when things were simple, before Isabel's poison had seeped into their lives. Ryan's car pulled up beside his, and Daniel barely waited for him to cut the engine before stepping out. Ryan met him halfway, his face tense, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets.
This is insane,
Ryan muttered.
Natalie wouldn't just disappear like this.
Daniel nodded.
I need your help. We have to find her.
Ryan hesitated, then exhaled and gave a sharp nod.
Then let's get to work.
Ryan drummed his fingers against the dashboard as the rain pattered against the windshield. His face was tight with unease, his eyes shadowed by something Daniel recognized all too well, fear.
She didn't even say anything to me, man.
Ryan muttered.
No warning. Just silence.
Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel.
That's because she's not the one making the decisions.
Ryan let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face.
I don't want to believe Mom would go this far. But you're right. Something's off.
Ryan felt a little bad for his mother, but he was honest and fair and loved his sister and Daniel very much and was willing to stand up for them, no matter what his own mother stood on the other side.
There's not a moment to lose Daniel. We need to get into the house right away and get Natalie.
The estate loomed in the darkness, its towering walls casting long shadows beneath the pale moonlight. Rain drizzled against the windshield, tracing slow, uneven paths across the glass. The air inside the car was thick with unspoken words, tension coiling between Daniel and Ryan like an invisible wire pulled too tight.
She's in there.
Daniel murmured, gripping the steering wheel.
I can feel it.
Ryan exhaled sharply, shaking his head.
If Mom really did something to her,
He stopped himself, jaw clenching.
I don't even know what we're walking into.
Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the house.
Then let's stop talking and find out.
They moved swiftly, slipping through the iron gates like ghosts. Daniel knew Isabel's paranoia, knew the security system she so proudly boasted about. But paranoia made people predictable. and predictable people made mistakes. Ryan reached beneath a loose brick in the pathway and pulled out a key.
She never changes her hiding spots,
He muttered.
Arrogance.
Daniel took the key, pushing it into the lock. The door clicked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with paintings of smiling faces. Faces that had long since stopped smiling in real life. The scent of lavender and polished wood filled his lungs, cloying and suffocating. Then, a sound. Soft footsteps. Hesitant.
Daniel.
Daniel's heart lurched into his throat. That voice, weak, uncertain, sent a sharp blade of fear slicing through his chest.
Natalie.
His voice cracked on her name. A pause. Then, the sound of hesitant steps approaching. And then she was there, standing at the end of the hall, wrapped in a thick robe, her hair disheveled. But it was her eyes that shattered him. They were distant, unfocused, as if seeing him through a fog. He moved toward her instinctively, but she took half a step back. His stomach twisted into knots.
Natalie, what did she do to you?
She blinked slowly, struggling to grasp onto a thought that kept slipping away.
Daniel. I don't feel right.
Ryan let out a quiet curse. Daniel reached for her hands, but she swayed slightly, her balance unsteady. The realization struck him like lightning. She wasn't just exhausted. She was drugged.
Ryan,
Daniel said, his voice tight, urgent.
call an ambulance. Now.
Natalie's gaze flickered with something, fear recognition, but before she could say another word, another voice sliced through the air.
What the hell is going on here?
Isabel stood at the top of the staircase, her robe cinched tightly around her, her expression eerily calm. But Daniel saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes. She had been caught. And she knew it. The air grew heavier, the moment stretching unbearably thin. Then, Natalie's fingers twitched in his grasp. Weak. Seeking.
Daniel.
Her voice was barely a whisper.
Don't leave me.
A fresh wave of fury surged through him. He looked up at Isabel, and for the first time in his life, he saw her fear. Because this wasn't the same Daniel she had manipulated for years. This Daniel was ready to burn her world to the ground. The storm outside rumbled once more, but Daniel barely heard it. Because the real storm was about to begin. The night pressed down on them like a heavy weight as Daniel carried Natalie through the front door, into the open air. The cold should have made her shiver, but she was too weak, her body limp in his arms. Her fingers clutched weakly at his jacket, as if grounding herself in the one thing she still recognized him. Ryan was already on the phone, pacing in urgent circles.
We need an ambulance. Now. She's unresponsive, drugged.
He stopped, glancing at Natalie's barely conscious form.
I don't know what she was given. Just hurry.
Daniel tightened his grip on her, fury coiling in his chest like a snake ready to strike. His heart pounded against his ribs, the fear threatening to consume him. He looked down at Natalie's face, pale, her eyelids fluttering as if she were trapped in some nightmare she couldn't wake from.
Stay with me, baby, please. Just only stay with me.
A shadow moved in the doorway. It was Isabel. She stepped outside, her silk robe barely moving in the wind, her arms crossed over her chest. The mask of control she always wore was beginning to crack, but she still held onto that air of superiority, of untouchability.
You're making a mistake, Daniel.
He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head in disbelief.
A mistake?
His voice was raw, trembling with rage.
You drugged your own daughter, and I'm the one making a mistake?
Isabel sighed, tilting her head as if speaking to a foolish child.
She was fragile. She needed guidance.
Ryan turned on her, his fists clenched.
You manipulated her. You fed her lies until she couldn't think for herself anymore.
Isabel's expression darkened.
And what would you have done, Ryan? Left her to suffer? To be consumed by doubt and regret?
Daniel took a step toward her, his entire body shaking with the effort to keep himself from doing something he might regret.
You don't get to decide what she feels. You don't get to steal her choices, her life.
Isabel's lips curled into something almost sympathetic.
She wouldn't have survived without me.
A weak voice cut through the cold air.
That's not true.
Daniel's breath hitched. He looked down to see Natalie's eyes barely open, her gaze struggling to focus, but her words, soft as they were clear.
You did this to me.
She whispered, her voice fragile but edged with something stronger.
You made me doubt myself. You made me think I was nothing without you.
For the first time, Isabel's composure wavered.
Natalie, sweetheart, you're confused.
No,
Her fingers curled into Daniel's jacket, gripping him tighter.
I remember now.
The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Isabel's face flickered with something Daniel had never seen before: fear. Ryan stepped forward.
They're coming, Mom. And this time, you don't get to talk your way out of it.
Isabel's gaze darted between them, her brilliant mind calculating, searching for an escape. But there was none. The truth had finally caught up to her. A paramedic team rushed toward them, and Daniel reluctantly let go of Natalie as they carefully placed her onto a stretcher. His hands felt empty without her, but he never let go of her gaze.
I'm right here.
He murmured as she was lifted into the ambulance.
I'm not going anywhere.
Her lips parted, her voice barely a breath.
You promise me?
His chest tightened.
I promise.
The doors closed, and Daniel stepped back, watching as the ambulance sped into the night, carrying the woman he loved away from the nightmare Isabel had built around her. He turned slowly. Isabel stood frozen, her eyes following the flashing lights until they disappeared. For the first time, she looked small, defeated, exposed. Daniel exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air.
You lose.
The sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. And for the first time in her life, Isabel had nowhere left to run. The ambulance raced through the city, its sirens wailing, cutting through the night like a desperate cry for help. Cars veered to the sides, their headlights flashing as they made way for the speeding vehicle. Inside, the paramedics worked tirelessly, their hands steady despite the chaos. One monitored the patient's vitals, while another administered life-saving treatment, their voices calm yet urgent. The pulse of the heart monitor echoed inside the cabin, a fragile rhythm holding on to life. The city blurred past the windows, but inside the ambulance, time stood still, every second a battle between fate and survival. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet despair. The steady beeping of machines filled the sterile room, each pulse a haunting reminder of how close they had come to losing her. Daniel sat by Natalie's bedside, his hands curled around hers, feeling the fragile warmth of her skin beneath his fingers. She looked so small against the stark white sheets, her body weakened by the toxins Isabel had forced into her veins. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, as if she were still fighting against the fog in her mind. Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He had never felt so powerless. Ryan stood by the window, arms crossed, his face a mask of anger barely held in check.
She's going to pay for this,
He muttered.
Every single thing she's done to Natalie, she's going to rot for it.
Daniel barely heard him. His entire world had narrowed to the slow rise and fall of Natalie's chest, the slight tremble in her fingers, the way her lips parted like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the strength.
Natalie?
He whispered.
Baby, can you hear me?
For a moment, nothing. Then, her eyelids fluttered. A weak breath. And then barely a whisper.
Daniel.
Relief crashed through him so hard it nearly stole his breath. He squeezed her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles.
I'm here. I'm not going anywhere.
Her gaze was distant, unfocused.
It was her, wasn't it?
Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Tears welled in her eyes.
She said I was sick. That I needed her. I believed her.
Daniel's jaw clenched.
She made you believe that. She fed you lies and poison, Natalie. But you're free now.
Her fingers curled weakly around his.
Am I?
His heart cracked at the quiet doubt in her voice. He cupped her face gently, forcing her to look at him.
Yes, and I swear to you, she will never hurt you again.
Ryan turned from the window, his expression dark.
Speaking of that, the police are waiting outside. They want to talk to Natalie when she's ready.
Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't want to put her through this. Not yet. Not while she was so fragile. But they had no choice. Isabel had to be stopped. And only Natalie could give them the final piece of the puzzle. Natalie let out a shaky breath, her fingers twitching in Daniel's grasp.
I'll do it.
Daniel's eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of hesitation, of fear. Instead, he saw something else, resolve. The same quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place.
You don't have to do this now,
he said gently. Natalie shook her head.
Yes, I do. If I don't, she wins.
Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead, his heart aching with love and sorrow.
Then we end this. Together.
As the door opened and the detective stepped inside, Daniel tightened his grip on Natalie's hand, silently promising her that no matter what came next, she would never have to face it alone. The storm had passed, but inside Daniel, it raged stronger than ever. The evidence was secured, the truth finally in their hands, yet victory felt hollow. The battle was far from over. Natalie lay in her hospital bed, the dim light casting soft shadows over her fragile frame. She had barely spoken since giving her statement to the police. The weight of years spent under Isabel's control had left its scars, not just on her body, but deep in her mind. Daniel watched her, aching for the woman she had once been, the fire in her eyes, the unshakable spirit that had drawn him in from the start. She looked so lost now, like a ghost of herself. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles.
Natalie,
he murmured, his voice raw.
Talk to me.
Her lips parted, but the words never came. Instead, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Daniel's heart clenched.
I'm here. I'm not going anywhere.
Her fingers twitched in his grasp.
I don't know who I am without her,
she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel inhaled sharply, pain searing through him. He had always known Isabel's grip on Natalie was suffocating, but hearing it from her lips made it all the more unbearable.
You're you,
he said firmly.
Not who she made you believe you had to be.
She turned her head to face him, her gaze searching his.
What if that's not enough?
Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat.
It's enough for me.
For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She squeezed his hand back. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Ryan stepped in, his face pale, his jaw set.
The police took her in for questioning, but they'll most likely release her until the circumstances are clarified.
Daniel let out a slow breath.
Now we need to hurry to find indisputable evidence.
But Natalie flinched, curling in on herself.
Really? I'll be worried about you.
Daniel and Ryan exchanged a look. She was right. The legal battle would take time. Isabel's influence ran deep, and people like her didn't fall quietly. But for now, at least, Natalie was safe. Ryan knelt beside her bed.
You don't have to be afraid anymore.
Natalie let out a shaky breath, her fingers still clinging to Daniel's.
I don't know how.
Daniel pressed his forehead to her hand, his voice thick with emotion.
Then let me show you.
Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, there was something else there too, hope. And that was enough to keep fighting. The night was thick with tension as Daniel and Ryan stepped into Isabel's office. The room was a shrine to control. Dark mahogany shelves lined with meticulously arranged books, a pristine desk with not a single item out of place. The air smelled of leather and aged paper, but beneath it, there was something rotten. Something hidden. Daniel's fingers tightened into fists as he took in the cold perfection of it all. This was where she had orchestrated everything: the lies, the manipulation, the slow poisoning of Natalie's mind. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair.
We need proof. Something concrete. She's too good at twisting words, at making herself look like the victim.
Daniel nodded, already moving toward the desk.
Then let's find it.
They worked in silence, rifling through drawers, scanning through paperwork. Isabel was careful, too careful. Every file was meticulously organized, every document perfectly aligned. But Daniel knew something about control. The more someone tried to maintain it, the more cracks they left behind. Ryan pulled open a locked drawer, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped through the contents. His breath hitched.
Daniel, you need to see this.
Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides, his stomach twisting as Ryan handed him a thick folder. Inside were legal documents, each one stamped with official seals. But it was the signatures that made his blood run cold. Natalie's name was on every page.
She never signed these,
Ryan said, his voice tight with anger.
Look at the dates. She was in the hospital recovering from one of Mom's episodes when these were supposedly signed.
Daniel flipped through the pages, his jaw clenching. The documents handed Isabel full control over Natalie's assets, medical decisions, and even her personal affairs.
She forged them,
Daniel whispered, fury rising in his chest like a storm.
She was planning to take everything.
Ryan let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it.
She already had everything. Power, influence over Natalie's mind. This was just the final move.
Daniel's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, snapping pictures of every page. This was it. This was what they needed.
Let's go,
he said, his voice steel.
Before she realizes we were here.
They turned for the door, but before they could reach it, a shadow moved in the hallway. A slow clap echoed through the air.
Well done.
Isabel's voice purred, smooth as silk.
You finally learned how to play the game.
Daniel's blood turned to ice as she stepped into the doorway, blocking their exit. Her robe was draped elegantly over her shoulders, her expression eerily calm, but her eyes burned with something dark and dangerous. Ryan stiffened beside him.
It's over, Mom.
Isabel tilted her head, a slow smile curving her lips.
Do you really think so?
Daniel held up his phone, meeting her gaze with unwavering determination.
We have proof. This isn't just manipulation anymore. It's a crime. Fraud. Coercion. Forgery.
Isabel's lips twitched, but for the first time, there was something else in her gaze. Uncertainty.
You think you've won.
She murmured.
You think the truth is enough.
Daniel took a step forward, his voice deadly quiet.
It is.
For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Isabel's shoulders squared, and the mask of icy control slipped firmly back into place.
If you walk out that door,
she said, voice cold and clipped,
there's no coming back.
Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it.
I never planned to.
He pushed past her, Ryan at his side, their footsteps heavy with finality. Isabel didn't follow. She didn't call out. She simply stood there, watching as the walls of her empire began to crumble around her. As they stepped into the night, Daniel inhaled deeply, the weight on his chest finally beginning to lift. The evidence was in their hands. The truth was no longer just a whisper between them. It was a weapon. And they were going to use it. The morning air was thick with the weight of inevitability. A gray dawn stretched over the city, casting long shadows against the cold pavement. Daniel stood outside Natalie's hospital room, his fingers clenched into fists at his sides. Today was the day. The day justice would finally catch up to Isabel. Ryan paced beside him, his steps restless, his nerves barely contained beneath his rigid posture.
"The police are on their way,"
he murmured,
glancing down at his phone. "They'll be at the house in 20 minutes.
Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to steady the storm raging inside him. He had spent so long fighting against Isabel's control, so long watching her twist reality, manipulate, destroy. And now, finally, she was about to answer for it all. The door behind them creaked open, and Natalie stepped out. She was still pale, still weak, but there was something in her eyes, something Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. Determination. She wrapped the hospital robe tighter around herself, her fingers trembling as she lifted her chin.
I want to see it.
Daniel frowned.
Natalie, you don't have to.
I need to.
She cut in, her voice quiet but firm.
I need to know she's really gone. That she can't touch me anymore.
Ryan hesitated, then nodded.
"We'll take you there."
The police cars were already lined up outside Isabel's estate by the time they arrived. Red and blue lights reflected off the pristine windows, shattering the illusion of power that Isabel had so carefully built. Daniel parked the car down the street, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he watched uniformed officers step up to the grand front doors. Then they knocked. A long silence stretched before the door finally swung open. Isabel stood there, wrapped in an elegant silk robe, her expression a mask of perfect control. But Daniel saw it, the slight widening of her eyes, the flicker of tension in her fingers as they clutched the doorframe. She knew.
"Isabel Thompson?"
One of the officers asked, his voice steady, impassive.
"You're under arrest for fraud, coercion, and administering controlled substances without consent."
For the first time in her life, Isabel hesitated. Daniel held his breath, waiting for the performance, the lies, the calculated tears. But none came. Instead, she let out a soft, incredulous laugh.
This is absurd,
She murmured, her voice silk and steel.
Do you have any idea who I am?
Ryan stepped forward, his voice sharp.
"You're a criminal."
A flicker of something passed over Isabel's face. Rage, disbelief, something close to fear. But she quickly buried it, tilting her chin up as if she were above it all.
This is a mistake.
She said smoothly, but her voice wavered just slightly.
I demand to speak to my lawyer.
"You'll have your chance,"
The officer replied.
"Turn around."
For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Daniel felt the weight of her shadow begin to lift. The officers pulled out the handcuffs, and Isabel took a step back, her control slipping.
Wait.
She started, but the words fell flat. No one was listening to her anymore. The cold steel locked around her wrists. Natalie inhaled sharply beside Daniel, and when he turned, he saw something shift in her expression. A breath of relief. A release of chains she had carried for far too long. As Isabel was led down the steps toward the waiting car, she turned, her gaze locking onto Natalie's. For a brief moment, there was something almost human in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The door to the police car slammed shut. The sirens wailed. And Isabel Thompson was driven away. The cold steel locked around her wrists. Natalie inhaled sharply beside Daniel, and when he turned, he saw something shift in her expression. A breath of relief. A release of chains she had carried for far too long. As Isabel was led down the steps toward the waiting car, she turned, her gaze locking onto Natalie's. For a brief moment, there was something almost human in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The door to the police car slammed shut. The sirens wailed. And Isabel Thompson was driven away. Natalie let out a shuddering breath.
She's really gone.
Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers.
She is.
A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was freedom. The courtroom was silent, yet the air crackled with tension. Every breath, every shift in a seat felt amplified in the vast wood-paneled room. The weight of justice, long overdue, pressed down on the atmosphere like a storm waiting to break. Isabel sat at the defendant's table, a picture of cold elegance. Her hands rested neatly on the polished surface, her expression unreadable. She wore a suit as pristine as ever, her posture as poised as if she were merely attending another one of her social galas. But beneath the facade, Daniel could see it, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly. She was afraid, but she would never let the world see it. Daniel sat beside Natalie, his hand resting lightly on hers. She hadn't spoken much since that morning, but her grip was strong, her breathing steady. He knew this was the hardest thing she had ever done. But she was ready.
All rise,
the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. The judge entered, a man with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. The trial began. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the evidence methodically, documented proof of forged signatures, records of unauthorized medical prescriptions, testimonies from former employees who had witnessed Isabel's quiet reign of terror. Ryan testified first, his voice steady but laced with anger. He spoke of the years of manipulation, of how their mother had controlled Natalie's life like a puppet master pulling invisible strings. But it was Natalie's testimony that shifted the entire room. She walked to the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps. The courtroom was silent as she took her oath, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the stand. When she looked up, her gaze met Isabel's for the briefest second. A ghost of something passed between them, perhaps the last remnant of a twisted, broken bond. Then Natalie looked away.
Miss Thompson,
The prosecutor began gently.
Can you describe the kind of control your mother exerted over you?
Natalie inhaled shakily.
She told me I was weak.
She said, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger.
That I wasn't capable of making decisions for myself. That I needed her, or I would fall apart.
A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Isabel remained still, her mask unbroken, but Daniel saw the tightness in her jaw.
She monitored everything,
Natalie continued.
my finances, my health, my relationships. If I ever tried to pull away, she would convince me I was sick. She would
Natalie swallowed hard.
She would give me medication I didn't need. Tell me I was unstable. That without her, I would destroy myself.
A sharp intake of breath came from someone in the jury. The prosecutor stepped closer.
And do you believe that be true?
Natalie lifted her chin, her voice clear and unwavering.
No.
For the first time since the trial began, Isabel moved. Her fingers curled into fists, her perfect mask finally cracking at the edges. Daniel felt his chest tighten with pride and sorrow all at once. This was Natalie's fight, her final act of defiance against a lifetime of control. And she was winning. The defense scrambled to paint Isabel as a misunderstood mother, a woman merely acting in the best interest of her daughter. But the jury saw through it. The evidence was too damning, the testimonies too raw. It took them less than an hour to deliberate. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Isabel's expression didn't change. She simply sat there, staring straight ahead as if refusing to acknowledge the end of her empire. But it was over. Natalie let out a breath, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Daniel took her hand in his, grounding her in this new reality. For the first time in her life, she was free. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The sound echoed through the courtroom, sealing Isabel's fate.
15 years in federal prison,
the judge declared, her voice devoid of sympathy.
for fraud, coercion, and unlawful medical practices.
Isabel didn't flinch. She sat motionless, her spine rigid, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Even now, even as the weight of justice bore down on her, she refused to break. But Daniel could see it, the slight tremor in her fingers, the flicker of disbelief in her otherwise unreadable eyes. For the first time in her life, she had lost. And there was no way out. Natalie sat beside him, her breath shallow. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply stared at the woman who had controlled every moment of her existence, the woman who had dictated her thoughts, poisoned her body, and wrapped her in invisible chains for years. And now, that woman was being led away in cuffs, her designer suit a sharp contrast to the cold steel shackles around her wrists. As the guards escorted Isabel out of the courtroom, she turned, just once. Her eyes met Natalie's. There was no plea, no apology. Just silence. A silence that stretched across a lifetime of manipulation and broken love. Then she was gone. Natalie exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry years of weight with it. She turned to Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper.
It's over.
He took her hand in his, pressing his lips against her knuckles.
Yeah,
He murmured.
it is.
They left the city that same week. The house where Isabel's presence lingered in every corner was sold without a second thought. The memories trapped inside those walls were not worth keeping. Daniel and Natalie packed what little they truly wanted: photographs, books, pieces of their past that hadn't been tainted, and walked away from everything else. 1 year had passed. The seasons had come and gone, carrying away the ghosts of yesterday. The past no longer clung to Natalie's skin like an invisible shroud. It had taken time, long, painful months of unlearning, of rediscovering who she was beyond the woman Isabel had shaped her into. But now, standing on the balcony of their new home, she could finally breathe without the weight of old chains wrapped around her lungs. The air was warm with the scent of summer, the wind weaving through her hair like a whisper of something new. Daniel stood beside her, his presence as steady as ever, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. They had built this life together, not out of fear or survival, but out of choice. Out of love. Natalie closed her eyes and listened, to the rustling of the trees, the distant laughter of children playing down the street, the rhythmic beating of her own heart. It was all so quiet. Not the kind of silence that used to terrify her, not the silence that had once been filled with the absence of her own voice. This was different. This was peace. She exhaled, a slow, trembling breath, and turned to Daniel. He was already watching her as he always did, not with expectation, not with worry, but with the quiet patience of a man who had walked through fire by her side.
I think I finally believe it.
She whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind.
That I'm free.
Daniel's lips parted slightly, as if the words had taken him by surprise, but then a slow smile spread across his face, the kind that reached his eyes, filling the spaces where shadows once lurked.
You are.
He said simply. Natalie let those words settle deep into her bones. For so long, she had carried the fear that freedom was an illusion, that at any moment, she would wake up back in the prison of her past. But not anymore. Freedom wasn't just the absence of Isabel. It wasn't the lack of control, the disappearance of manipulation. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't from sorrow. She tilted her face up toward the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun against her skin, and let herself smile. For the first time in her life, she was not running from something. She was running toward it.
And so, friends, did you enjoy this story? Do you think the children were too harsh on their mother? And what do you believe drove her to such an action? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Thank you all for watching.